The great hall fell silent when the gavel came down. Not the dignified silence of a decision made. Not the respectful hush of a noble union. This was the suffocating silence of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting to see if anyone would shatter into pieces first. Elowen stood in the auction block, dressed in white silk that looked less like a bride's gown and more like a lamb dressed for slaughter. The irony wasn't lost on her. Nothing was lost on her anymore. Not since the day Vanick had looked her in the eyes and spoken 5 words that had fractured her entire existence. The bond is a lie. Now, 3 weeks later, she was being sold to the highest bidder. Not as a mate, not as a queen, as property. As the thing a rejected woman became when the Wolf King declared her unmarked and unworthy. Vanick sat on his throne. The Wolf King, the alpha of alphas, the one she'd been promised to since birth. And his face was carved from ice. Cold, untouchable. Exactly as he'd been every time she'd tried to reach him before the bond had shattered. His rival, Theron of the Northern Packs, bid higher, and higher, and higher still. But when the final bid came, when Vanick rose from his throne and offered his entire kingdom, his crown, his absolute dominion over Valorian itself, the gasps that rippled through the crowd meant nothing. Because somewhere in the middle of that auction, Elowen had stopped being afraid. And somewhere around the moment he bid everything, she'd started to understand. This wasn't about possession. This was about erasing her. Buying her from the market he'd thrown her into, then disappearing her into the palace dungeons where no one would ever whisper her name again. The rival bid higher still, and Vanick's jaw clenched. For the first time she saw it. Desperation. Real primal need. He didn't want her anymore. He wanted her gone. Wanted the problem of her existence solved before it metastasized into something he couldn't control. The sarcastic thought that flickered through her mind was sharper than any blade. Well, at least now I know my worth. Even if you're trying to buy me out of existence. The gavel fell. She was sold to Theron for a price that made even the hardened pack elders gasp. But as they led her away, as Vanick watched from his throne with an expression of something that might have been relief, Elowen caught a glimpse of something in the crowd. A woman with silver-streaked hair, watching with eyes that glowed faintly in the torchlight. The woman didn't look away, didn't bow to Vanick's authority. She nodded, once, directly at Elowen, and everything changed. The kingdom of Valorian had operated under one sacred law for 1,000 years. The moon goddess chooses mates, and packs obey. Alphas rule. Betas follow. Omegas serve. And the rejected ones? They simply ceased to exist, stripped of pack bonds and cast into a liminal space where they belonged to no one and nothing. Or at least that's what they were supposed to do. The problem with absolute systems is that they assume absolute obedience. And Valorian had been stable for 7 generations under one assumption. That the Wolf King was always right. Vanick had inherited that assumption along with his throne. He was born into it, baptized in it, crowned in absolute certainty of it. For 7 years, he'd ruled with an authority that made lesser alphas kneel without question. His bloodline was old. Not quite as old as some, but old enough. His power was considerable. His mastery of political strategy was the only thing sharper than his fangs. And he had rejected her publicly. Elowen had been raised as a ward in the palace. Human-looking, at least on the surface. No obvious markers of the ancient bloodline she carried. The one that had been hidden for 300 years. When the mate bond had snapped into place on her 21st year, during the coronation ceremony itself, everyone in Valorian had held their breath. The moon goddess had chosen. The alpha would claim. The kingdom would celebrate. Instead, Vanick had stepped back from her touch. His eyes had gone cold. And he'd spoken those 5 words to the entire assembled court. The bond is a lie. No explanation. No merci. Just absolute denial of everything the moon goddess had ordained. And because he was king, the pack had learned not to question his judgment. But there was a problem with his certainty. He was wrong. The bond wasn't a lie. It was a test. Elowen came from the royal line of the Moonblessed, the ancient bloodline that had ruled Valorian long before the current Wolf King dynasty took power. Her ancestors had been keepers of old magic, guardians of fate itself. They'd had the power to shape destinies, to hear the voice of the goddess directly, to shift into forms that transcended the crude wolf transformation that regular werewolves used. The bloodline had been hidden for 3 centuries, buried in false histories and fabricated genealogies. Her mother had married a human merchant, diluting the line so thoroughly that it became invisible. Elowen had grown up believing herself truly human, unaware that her blood carried the weight of 300 years of suppressed power. But the moon goddess didn't forget her chosen daughters. And she didn't make mistakes. The mate bond hadn't been a lie. It had been a call. A summons for Elowen to wake up to what she really was before a claiming could bind her power to a king who would consume it entirely. Vanick had sensed something wrong about the bond, that much was true. What he didn't understand was that he'd sensed the wrongness of himself. He was incompatible with her power, not because the goddess had erred, but because she was too dangerous for him to control. By rejecting her, he'd done exactly what the goddess intended. He'd freed her, and in doing so, he'd guaranteed his own downfall. The woman in the crowd, the one with silver-streaked hair, had known this. Her name was Morrigan, and she'd been the keeper of Elowen's bloodline secrets for 20 years. She'd watched and waited for the moment when the girl would finally wake up. The auction had been that moment. The coronation ceremony had been 3 weeks earlier. A spectacle designed to cement Vanick's power for another generation. Thousands of guests filled the grand hall. Packs from rival territories had sent their strongest warriors. The human nobility had worn their finest jewels, completely oblivious to the supernatural tsunami happening beneath their champagne-sipping conversations. Elowen had felt it the moment the doors opened. The mate bond hit like a physical force, not pushing her toward the earth, but pulling her upward, outward, toward him. Her wolf, which had always been quiet and controllable, had suddenly stirred beneath her skin with a hunger she'd never experienced before. For a moment, she'd forgotten how to breathe. She'd known about the bond conceptually. Every wolf in Valorian knew that when they met their fated mate, they'd feel an undeniable pull, a recognition at the soul level, a completion of something that had always been fragmented. But knowing and experiencing were catastrophically different things. When she looked across the hall and found Vanick, she'd seen him truly for the first time, not the distant, untouchable figure she'd glimpsed in the palace halls, not the legend painted by courtiers and pack elders. Just him, his eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was perpetually bracing for an attack. And in that moment, she'd understood. I could love this man, easily, completely. I could spend my entire life trying to earn whatever he withholds from me. The realization had been both intoxicating and terrifying. Vanick had moved toward her. The crowd had hushed. Her heart had hammered so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. When he reached her, he'd leaned down and breathed in her scent. The ritual bonding would have happened there in that moment. Their souls would have merged. Their wolves would have become one creature instead of two. She'd felt the moment of inevitability, the point of no return. And then something had shifted in his expression. A flicker of uncertainty, a recoil. Something's wrong, he'd said quietly, only for her to hear. With the bond. With you. Her stomach had dropped. I don't understand, she'd whispered back. He'd stepped away from her. Slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. And when he'd turned to face the crowd, his expression had hardened into something implacable. The bond is a lie, he'd announced to the entire kingdom. She is not my true mate. She is a deceiver, or the goddess has made an error for the first time in history. The silence that followed had been absolute. Elowen had stood frozen, watching as every eye in the hall turned toward her. She could see the moment the court decided what to believe. Not that their alpha was wrong, but that she had somehow tricked the moon goddess herself. One courtier, the Lady Ashira, who'd always been kind to her, had looked away. That small gesture of withdrawal had hurt worse than any direct condemnation. "Remove her," Vanick had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "She is no longer a ward of this house. She is no longer marked. From this moment forward, she exists outside pack protection. She is nobody." And in that moment, something had crystallized inside Elowen. Nobody. Yes, perfect. Because nobody means I owe you nothing. Nobody means I can become anything. But she'd hidden that thought behind a mask of devastation. It was easier that way. Easier to let them see her as broken, as the human girl who'd somehow fooled the goddess, as a cautionary tale of humiliation and rejection. It had taken her 3 weeks to understand that Vanick hadn't rejected her because she was unworthy. He'd rejected her because he'd sensed her power and been terrified of it. And that was the moment she'd decided to give him something to really fear. The first week after the rejection, Elowen had existed in a state of numbness. The pack had treated her with a mixture of pity and disgust. She was the human girl who'd tricked the moon goddess, or been deemed unworthy by the one being in the world whose opinion mattered. Either way, she was broken goods. She'd been moved to a small room in the servants' quarters. The guards at the doors were ostensibly for her protection, but they were really there to make sure she didn't try to contact Vanick, didn't cause a scene, didn't exist in any way that might remind the court of the king's mistake. On the second day, Lady Ashira had come to visit her. Elowen had expected pity. What she'd gotten was something more complex. "He's terrified of you," Ashira had said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "I've known Vanick since we were children. I've never seen him afraid." "I'm nobody," Elowen had replied flatly. "That's what he said. Nobody." "Exactly," Ashira had nodded. "That's why he had to reject you publicly. If he'd simply broken the bond quietly, the court would have whispered questions, would have wondered what you were. But a public rejection? That makes you invisible. That makes people not want to look at you too closely." Elowen had processed this. "You think he sensed something? I know he did. I've seen him fight enemies. I've seen him strategize against rival packs. I've never seen him run away from anything until you." Ashira had paused. "Whatever you are, it scares him. And scared kings are dangerous kings." By the third week, the humiliation had taken on new dimensions. Pack members would deliberately walk past her in the corridors and turn their heads away, a gesture of disrespect that was supposed to make her feel like a phantom. The servants who'd been kind to her stopped meeting her eyes. The courtiers who'd once flattered her began to treat her like furniture. She became invisible by design, a reminder of the king's mistake made flesh. But it was the mate bond that had truly broken her. Even in rejection, it was still there, still thrumming beneath her skin, still pulling her toward Vanick with a hunger she couldn't control. Her wolf wanted him with an intensity that made her want to claw through her own skin. Every fiber of her being ached for him to change his mind, to walk back his words, to claim her already. It was weakness. It was pathetic. And it was destroying her from the inside out. She'd started having dreams where she'd go to him, beg him to reconsider, throw herself at his feet and convince him that whatever he'd sensed in her could be controlled, suppressed, hidden. In those dreams, she'd been willing to make herself small enough to fit into whatever box he wanted her in. The sarcasm that had always been her shield had sharpened into something darker. "At least he's consistent. Can't even reject you without making it a performance." It was during the fourth week that everything had changed. She'd been sleeping in the servants' quarters, her wolf pacing circles beneath her skin with restless rage. And then, without warning, the world had fractured. She was no longer in her room. She was standing in a temple made of moonstone, suspended between the earth and sky. Around her, the walls pulsed with an ethereal silver light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Her hand, when she looked down, was no longer pale human skin. It was covered in ancient markings that glowed like captured starlight. Symbols, language, power written in the form of visible light. And then a voice, not in words but in knowing. The kind of communication that bypassed language entirely and lodged itself directly into her consciousness. Daughter of the old blood, heir of the royal line, you were marked for rejection to break the chains that bind you, to remember what you truly are before the claiming would have erased you entirely. Your mate would have consumed your power. The bond would have made you willing to let him. But I am the goddess of the wild hunt, and I do not leave my chosen ones chained. Elowen had jolted awake, gasping, but the markings were still there, faint, but undeniable when she traced her fingertips across her own forearm. For the first time since the rejection, she'd understood. The Wolf King's cruel words hadn't been a mistake. They'd been a mercy she was only beginning to comprehend. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The pain of rejection hadn't gone away. The ache of the bond hadn't vanished. But they'd been transformed into something else entirely. Fuel, purpose, a reason to become something stronger than she'd ever imagined. Vanick had thrown her away thinking she was human. He was about to discover that he'd thrown away a goddess. The morning after the vision, Elowen couldn't hide what she was anymore. The markings on her skin had become visible in daylight. Silver lines that traced patterns across her forearms, her shoulders, her collarbone. When the servants saw them, they'd whispered. When word reached the court, she'd seen the fear in people's eyes. Vanick had called her before him. She'd expected anger. What she'd gotten was something far more dangerous. Confusion. He'd stared at the marks on her skin like they were a personal betrayal. "What are you?" he'd demanded. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she'd answered honestly. "But I'm starting to remember." Something had flickered across his face. Regret? Rage? She couldn't quite read it. The bond. "The bond is still there," she'd interrupted. "We both know it. But it's not pulling me toward you anymore. It's pulling me toward this." She'd held up her marked hand, and the symbols had glowed brighter. "Toward whatever I'm supposed to become." He'd stood up from his throne. For a moment, she'd thought he'd reach for her, claim her anyway, bind her power to his before she could fully access it. But then Morrigan, the silver-haired woman from the auction crowd, had stepped forward from the shadows. And Elowen was the first heir to wake up in 3 centuries. Over the next 2 weeks, she'd learned the old spells. The shifting techniques that went beyond the basic wolf form. How to draw power from the moon itself. How to move between shadows. How to hear the thoughts of others across great distances. How to hide her true nature from even the most powerful alpha senses. And with each spell, each technique, each new layer of power, she'd felt something dark and beautiful crystallizing inside her. The mate bond was still there, but it was changing, inverting. Instead of pulling her toward Vanick, it was becoming a weapon. A connection she could use to understand his fears, his weaknesses, his secrets. She didn't need to bind herself to him anymore. She could bind him to his own doom. The sarcastic thought that came this time was sharper than all the others. "You wanted to be rid of me? Congratulations, Your Majesty. You just gave me every reason and every tool to become the one thing you can never defeat. And the cruelest part? I would have loved you. I would have been everything you wanted. But you chose fear instead. And now you're going to understand exactly what you threw away." The wolf inside her didn't howl in pain anymore. It laughed. By week 6 after the rejection, Elowen had moved beyond the palace entirely. She'd left in the dead of night, using the old tunnels that Morrigan had shown her. Passages that predated Vanick's kingdom by centuries. She'd emerged in the Shadowwood, the ancient forest that surrounded Valorian, and she'd begun to build something no one had anticipated. A pack that wasn't built on fear. The first to join her were the obvious choices. The exiled ones. The Beta's daughter who'd been cast out for challenging her father's authority. The Omega who'd been marked as defective because they didn't respond to the traditional hierarchy. The warrior woman who'd refused to bow to Vanick's regime and had been stripped of her rank. But as word spread through the underground networks of Valorian's outcasts, others had come. A healer who'd been banished for practicing old magic. A scholar who'd been silenced for asking questions about the pre-Wolf King dynasty. Young warriors tired of the rigid hierarchy. Pack members who'd seen through Vanick's authority and found it hollow. Elowen hadn't recruited them. She hadn't needed to. She'd simply been herself. Open, honest, powerful in a way that terrified and inspired in equal measure. And people had gravitated toward her like she was a new center of gravity. Morrigan had introduced her to the old ways of leading. Not through dominance or fear, but through authentic connection. Through showing her followers that their pain mattered, their thoughts counted, their lives had value beyond what the pack hierarchy had told them. And something extraordinary had happened. They'd thrived. Within 3 weeks, she had over 100 followers. Within 6 weeks, it was 200. Warriors who trained not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in something. Healers who shared knowledge freely instead of hoarding it for power. Pack members who'd never experienced genuine respect from their leaders before, and were discovering what it felt like to be truly seen. The Shadow Pack became legend in Valorian's underground. People whispered about the girl who'd been rejected by the Wolf King, the one with the silver markings, the one who could shift into forms that defied description. Some said she was a demon. Others claimed she was blessed by the goddess herself. A few whispered the truth. She was becoming something Vanick had never anticipated having to fight. She was becoming a leader, and Vanick was finally starting to realize his mistake. Vanick discovered something was wrong when his trackers began disappearing. Not dying, at least not in any way they could find evidence of. They simply vanished into the Shadowwood, and when they stumbled back into the pack territories days later, they brought stories that made even hardened warriors nervous. They spoke of a woman who moved like moonlight, of eyes that glowed with an ancient fury, of power that tasted like silver and rain and the end of the world, of being offered a choice, return to Vanick and the hierarchy, or stay and find out what freedom actually felt like. Most of them chose freedom. At first, Vanick had convinced himself it was nothing. A rogue werewolf with delusions of grandeur. Some lesser creature with ambitions it couldn't possibly achieve. He'd ruled for 7 years without a true threat, and he wasn't about to believe that the human girl he'd rejected had suddenly become one. But then his own warriors started disappearing. The Beta's daughter first. No surprise there. She'd always been a problem. But then the Omega and then several of the younger warriors. Vanick had sent trackers after them, ordered their return, threatened execution for treason. None of it had mattered, because they'd found something with Elowen that they'd never found in Valorian. A reason to fight that wasn't based on fear. The Wolf King had called a council meeting, and his generals had looked at each other with barely concealed concern. For the first time since his coronation, his authority was being questioned. Not overtly, but the way his second-in-command hesitated before responding. The way the warrior women exchanged glances. The slight pause before they answered his orders. It was all there. She's recruiting from the outcasts. His general, Kane, had reported carefully. Building something in the Shadowwood. She calls it the Free Pack. The Free Pack, Vanick had repeated, tasting the words like poison. And how many does she have? Best estimate? 200. Maybe more. The council had gone silent. They're no match for our warriors, one of the older pack elders had said, but even he hadn't sounded convinced. Vanick had felt something crack inside his chest. Not fear exactly, he was too arrogant for actual fear, but something close to it. A recognition of a miscalculation so fundamental that it might actually cost him everything. He'd rejected her because he'd sensed her power and had wanted to contain it, control it, or better yet, eliminate the threat before it could fully manifest. Instead, he'd done the one thing that could guarantee her rise. He'd given her nothing to lose. The realization had been bitter as ash. That night, alone in his chambers, Vanick had allowed himself to think about what he'd thrown away. Not just power, though that was part of it, but the connection that mate bonds created. The soul-level recognition. The fact that she would have followed him anywhere, believed in him absolutely, loved him despite his cruelty because that's what the bond demanded. He could have had a queen who matched his power, supported his vision, stood beside his throne with undeniable authority. Instead, he'd created an enemy who understood him perfectly and wanted him destroyed. The cruel irony was that she was right to want it. He knew it now, understood it with perfect clarity. He'd become so obsessed with maintaining control that he'd made himself incapable of genuine connection. He'd rejected the one person who could have made him less alone. But understanding and fixing it were two different things. And Elowen had stopped looking back at him with the possibility of redemption in her eyes a long time ago. Elowen didn't sneak back into the capital. She walked through the front gates at noon, in broad daylight, with 300 followers at her back. The guards at the gates had frozen, completely unprepared for the reality of what they were seeing. Not a stealth attack, not a siege, just arrival. Peaceful, undeniable, impossible to ignore. They'd sent frantic messages to the palace. By the time she reached the Great Hall, Vanick was waiting on his throne. His entire court was arrayed around him like a final defense, but everyone could see the cracks in their confidence. Elowen had walked directly down the center of the hall. With every step, the air itself had changed. The temperature had dropped. The lights had flickered and steadied. Her power had been so overwhelming that lesser wolves had struggled to breathe. She'd stopped 10 feet from his throne. Not submissive, not challenging, just present. And then she'd spoken. "Hello, Vanick." The use of his name, not his title, just his name, had made something in his expression crack. Elowen. He'd said it like a curse, like a prayer, like both at once. "What have you done?" "What you made possible," she'd replied. "I'm here to offer you a choice." She gestured, and the court had seen what was waiting outside the hall. Not an army ready to slaughter, but an army nonetheless, prepared, disciplined, and absolutely certain of their purpose. "Abdicate your throne voluntarily," she continued, "and you'll be allowed to leave Valorian with whatever followers still want to go with you. You'll be stripped of your power, released from your alpha bonds, but you'll live. You'll be free to start over somewhere else. Some other kingdom, some other pack. A second chance." Vanick had stood up from his throne, and for a moment, she'd thought he'd attack her. The mate bond had thrummed between them, demanding completion even as it acknowledged her power. "And if I refuse?" he'd asked quietly. "Then we find out what happens when an old bloodline fights a new king," she'd said. "And I'm not entirely sure you survive it." She'd held his gaze, and in that moment, something had passed between them. An understanding of what they could have been if he'd chosen differently. If he'd been brave enough to let her be powerful alongside him instead of threatening him. But he'd made his choice 3 weeks ago when he'd stood in that coronation hall and spoken those 5 words. And now he was living with the consequences. "I need time," he'd said finally. "You have until sunrise," she'd replied. "Then the choice is made for you." She turned and walked back out of the hall, leaving him alone with his throne and the terrible weight of his own mistakes. Vanick didn't sleep that night. Instead, he'd spent the hours before dawn in his private chambers, surrounded by everything he'd fought to obtain. The crown, the throne, the absolute authority that had been his birthright and his obsession. And it had all meant nothing in the face of her power. He'd known, with absolute clarity, that he couldn't win a direct confrontation with her. She'd surpassed him, become something he couldn't match or overcome. All the strength he'd accumulated, all the dominance he'd cultivated, it was obsolete against what she'd become. But there was another choice, a darker one. Around midnight, he'd called for Cain, his general. "How many warriors would still fight for me?" Cain had been honest. Maybe 100. Not more. Against her 300? No, sir. Not against her 300. Vanick had nodded slowly. He'd known the answer before he'd asked. But sometimes you had to hear the failure out loud before you could accept it. By dawn, Vanick had made his decision. He'd walked into the great hall where Elowen was waiting, and instead of drawing his power to fight, he'd done something far more difficult. He'd surrendered it. "I abdicate," he'd said, his voice steady but stripped of all its former authority. "The throne is yours. Do with it what you will." Elowen had watched him carefully, searching for the trap. But there was no trap. Just a man who'd finally understood that some wars couldn't be won, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit defeat. "You'll leave Valorian?" she'd asked. "Yes," he'd confirmed. "I'll take whoever still wants to follow me. We'll go north, establish something new. Away from here." It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was something. An acknowledgement that he'd lost, and that continuing to fight would only destroy everything else. As he'd walked toward the doors, he'd paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the rejection. For how I did it. For everything." Elowen had said nothing. The mate bond that had tormented them both would be dissolved as soon as he left the kingdom. Their connection would be severed permanently. He would never hear her forgive him. He would never experience her love. He would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what he'd thrown away, and that knowledge would be a far crueler punishment than death. That was her mercy. The transition of power happened over 3 days. Elowen didn't take the throne herself. Instead, she'd established a council system where every pack territory had representation. Warriors, betas, omegas, healers, magic users, everyone had a voice, and decisions were made through genuine consensus rather than decree. It was radical. It was unprecedented. It was everything Vanick's regime had never allowed. By the 4th day, the kingdom was restructuring itself. Old power dynamics were dissolving. Pack members who'd been invisible under the old hierarchy suddenly found themselves with agency. The Omegas, no longer restricted by the rigid ranking system, began to discover the strengths they'd always had but had been forced to suppress. Magic users, who'd been hunted and silenced under Vanick, began to openly practice their craft. The healers who'd had to hide their abilities started training a new generation. Scholars who'd been forbidden to study the pre-Wolf King history were finally allowed to excavate the truth. And through it all, Elowen worked tirelessly to make sure that the new system didn't simply recreate the old one with a different figurehead. By the end of the first week, she'd stepped back from direct authority entirely. The council was functioning. The kingdom was reorganizing. People were learning how to lead without fear driving them. It wasn't perfect. There were conflicts, disagreements, moments where the old hierarchies tried to reassert themselves. But for the first time, those conflicts were being resolved through dialogue instead of dominance. Tragic. The moon rose over Valorian that night, and for the first time in centuries, it shone silver instead of gold. Elowen stood on the balcony overlooking her kingdom, watching the people below. Warriors training alongside Omegas. Healers teaching magic to anyone who wanted to learn. Scholars excavating history that had been buried for 3 centuries. Children growing up in a world where their value wasn't determined by their rank or their wolf strength or their bloodline. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still people clinging to old hierarchies, still pockets of resistance to the new way. But it was better, and it was hers. She thought about Vanick sometimes, not with the ache of the bond, but with something more complicated. Pity, maybe, respect for his choice to step aside. A strange, distant empathy for the fact that he'd loved her so much that he'd been willing to destroy her to protect her. It was twisted. It was painful. But it was also the most human thing he'd ever done. And maybe that was the real victory. Not his destruction, but his transformation. Not her dominance, but her ability to inspire actual change, even in the man she'd defeated. The wolf inside her was quiet now. not howling in rage or pain but settled, content, ready for whatever came next. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the council meeting beginning. Representatives from every territory gathered to discuss the new trade agreements, the harvest projections, the establishment of schools for young wolves who needed guidance. It was mundane. It was beautiful. It was everything she'd fought for. And as she turned to walk back inside, she caught her reflection in the window. Her eyes still glowed faintly silver. The marks on her skin still carried the weight of ancient power. But something else was there now. Peace. The girl who'd been auctioned off and rejected had become something neither Vanick nor anyone else in Valorian had anticipated. She'd become a leader, and the kingdom, for the first time in 1,000 years, was finally waking up to what that could mean. You just witnessed the rise of a queen who wasn't crowned by a king, but forged by rejection itself. And this is only the beginning. There are deeper secrets hidden in Valorian, darker forces stirring in distant lands, an old magic awakening that will challenge everything Elowen has built. Subscribe now to discover what's coming next.